Alright guys, Dominic here for KitGuru, and when Nvidia first announced the 3 new super GPUs that are slotting into the RTX 40 series lineup, well, I was immediately drawn to the RTX 4070 Ti Super. Admittedly, it does have an absolutely ridiculous name, but offering 10% more cores and a bump up to a 16GB frame buffer at the same price as the original 4070 Ti, well, that sounds pretty decent to me. Strap in then, as we are going to put this GPU through its paces, including a look at a last minute BIOS that Nvidia sent over. With the RTX 4070 Ti Super then, Nvidia has actually moved up to the AD103 GPU instead of AD104, which was used for the likes of the original 4070 and 4070 Ti. Not only does this mean a bump in core count up to 8,448 CUDA cores, along with increased Tensor, RT cores and ROPs, but crucially it means big upgrades for the memory subsystem. Gone is the 192-bit bus, and instead we get a 256-bit interface paired with 16 gigs of GDDR6X clocked at 21 gigabits a second, so total memory bandwidth is a third higher than what we got with the 4070 Ti. Power draw hasn't actually increased though, remaining at a 285 watt TGP. It's certainly an interesting spec on paper. 10% more cores, 50% more VRAM, all at the same asking price, being $799 or £769 for us in the UK. Well, on paper, that does sound pretty appealing. Of course though, we need to put it through its paces and find out exactly how good this GPU is, and for that we're using our regular GPU test system, which is provided to us by PC Specialist. This is based on Intel's i9-3900KS CPU, paired with the Gigabyte Z790 Gaming X AX motherboard, and we've also got 32 gigs of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR5 memory. It's also worth making clear that there's no Founders Edition for the 4070 Ti Super, so just like the original 4070 Ti, it's an AIB only launch. That does lead us on to something we need to talk about though, that being the BIOS situation, which was a pretty interesting development over the course of this review. So on Sunday the 21st of January at 8 PM, less than 2 days before this review goes live, I got an email from Nvidia which said this. We, being Nvidia, have discovered an issue with the MSI GeForce RTX 4070 Ti Super 16G Ventus 3X GPUs, which is the model I have, where performance was approximately 5% below expected figures on other RTX 4070 Ti Super SKUs. We expect your current testing will show performance with this updated VBIOS, which was also included in the email, is now approximately 3% below expected figures. MSI are continuing to work on updates, so please note this in your upcoming reviews. So basically, Nvidia are telling me that the GPU they sent me is performing about 5% below their expectations. I did of course ask them what the issue was and what changes this new BIOS might make, but they didn't tell me anything and I was basically left in the dark. Naturally, I did have a look at GPU-Z to see if I could spot any obvious differences with the new BIOS, though the power limit and rated clock speed remain unchanged. The voltage frequency curve is slightly different though, but only marginally, with the updated BIOS curve being ever so slightly lower in places, but nothing that really looks of significance to me. The only other thing left then was to do some testing, so I ran a 30-minute stress test in Cyberpunk 2077 using GPU-Z to log the clock speed. The updated BIOS did actually offer slightly higher sustained clock speeds by around 60 MHz or so I thought we might be onto something. However, after testing 3 different games at 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolutions, I did not observe any real performance gains using the updated BIOS. The frame rates in Alan Wake 2 were basically unchanged, and while I did see a small 2% increase in Cyberpunk at 1440p, that is very close to margin of error, and the performance at 1080p and 4K was virtually unchanged. The same also goes for A Plague Tale Requiem, where we just observed no significant differences. In short, I really don't know why the MSI Ventus 3X model isn't performing as well as Nvidia expects. At the time of filming, I've just had no concrete answers from either MSI or Nvidia. Nvidia did say that MSI is working on updates, but as of right now, this is all I have to go on. Now, that does mean that for all of the benchmarks you're going to see in this video, I did use the original BIOS. If further updates do come along, I'll be sure to let you know, and we might possibly do some extra testing, but as it stands, I'm filming this the day before launch, and I really need to crack on with the data I have, so we're going to go ahead and dive into the benchmarks. For these, I am focusing on 1440p and 4K, but I did also test 1080p, so if you want to see that data and every single one of the charts I created, you can do so over in the written review on KitGuruTech, which will also be linked down in the description below. Our first game of the day then is Alan Wake 2, where the RTX 4070 Ti Super managed 66 FPS at 1440p, making it 5% faster than the RTX 4070 Ti, but 7% slower than AMD's RX 7900 XT. Now at 4K it does catch up with the 7900 XT slightly, as it's now just 5% slower, but it's still only 5% faster than the original 4070 Ti, thanks to its average frame rate of 37 FPS. As for Assassin's Creed Mirage, at 1440p the 4070 Ti Super delivers 121 FPS on average, again making it 5% faster than the original 4070 Ti, while it's 7% and 12% slower than the 7900 XT and RTX 4080 respectively. 4K performance is more impressive however, with the Ti Super hitting 70 FPS on average. That makes it 10% faster than the 4070 Ti, likely due to the increased memory bandwidth, as I don't think we're exceeding 12 gigs of VRAM here. That result also pulls the Ti Super level with AMD's 7900 XT. Cyberpunk 2077 is up next, and at 1440p we're looking at a 6% gain over the original 4070 Ti, with the 4070 Ti Super delivering 94 FPS on average. Now, that still puts it 12% behind the 7900 XT, while it's also 17% slower than the 4080. Stepping up to 4K and we get 43 FPS without any form of upscaling, and that means the Ti Super is still 6% faster than the original 4070 Ti, but it is now 15% slower than AMD's 7900 XT. Forza Horizon 5 though does show us disappointing performance, as at 1440p the 4070 Ti Super only offers a 4% performance boost over the non-super 4070 Ti, and that puts it 10% behind the 7900 XT. Even at 4K, again we're just looking at a 4% upgrade over the original 4070 Ti, and it's still 10% slower than AMD's 7900 XT. Moving on though to The Last of Us Part 1, this is a game I was specifically looking forward to testing from the get-go due to its well-documented VRAM issues. While things have improved substantially with patches, at 1440p we can see a 13% lead for the 4070 Ti Super over the 4070 Ti. This I think is likely due to the increased memory bandwidth instead of VRAM, but it is a welcome performance boost and puts the Ti Super very close to the RX 7900 XT. Up at 4K, the gap widens further, with the 4070 Ti Super now 15% faster than the original 4070 Ti, delivering 54 FPS on average. It is however a touch slower than the 7900 XT, but only by 6%. Unfortunately, the gains are a lot smaller in A Plague Tale Requiem, with just a 3% lead for the 4070 Ti Super over the 4070 Ti, which is disappointing. Nvidia GPUs generally fare better in this game than AMD however, and the Ti Super is just 6% slower than the 7900 XT. Up at 4K we do see the Ti Super stretch its legs a bit, and it now comes in 6% faster than the original 4070 Ti, though it's also fallen 8% behind the 7900 XT. As for Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, Nvidia GPUs really do still struggle with the 1% lows in this game, which we had previously heard was due to the game's direct storage implementation. A workaround is possible, but we do test without modifying any game files. At 1440p for instance, the 4070 Ti Super is level with the 7900 XT on average, but looking at the 1% lows, it is well behind. This does even out a fair bit at 4K, where the 4070 Ti Super is still very close to the 7900 XT, though we're only looking at a 5% boost compared to the 4070 Ti. Moving on then to Red Dead Redemption 2, with an average of 93 FPS, the 4070 Ti Super puts itself 6% ahead of the 4070 Ti, but it still slots in 11% behind the RX 7900 XT. The same also goes for 4K, with the 4070 Ti Super still nice and fast, hitting over 60 FPS, but it's 7% faster than the 4070 Ti and 13% slower than AMD's 7900 XT. Resident Evil 4 is next though, and this one churns out high frame rates on most graphics cards tested, and we hit 137 FPS with the Ti Super at 1440p. That once again makes it 7% faster than the non-Super model, while it lags behind the 7900 XT by 11%. It is still very smooth at 4K, and this time we're looking at an 8% boost for the Ti Super versus the original model. It does however drop off quite noticeably versus the 7900 XT, as it's now 17% slower at this resolution. Moving on to the Unreal Engine 4 based Returnal, we're back in the territory of only pretty small performance gains for the 4070 Ti Super over the original 4070 Ti, as we're looking at just a 5% difference at 1440p, or barely a handful of frames. Thankfully, the gap does widen at 4K. We're now looking at a 7% difference between the two cards, and the Ti Super is only 6% slower than the 7900 XT, so this is one of the better results, but it's also still 16% behind the RTX 4080. Next up, we come to Starfield, a highly demanding game where the 4070 Ti Super can't even manage 60 FPS in our test area in the forests of Jemison. It's still 6% faster than the non-Super 4070 Ti, but once again it's 11% slower than the 7900 XT. Up at 4K though, and likely due to the increased memory bandwidth, the 4070 Ti can stretch its lead over the original 4070 Ti to 8% now, while it comes in 13% and 16% slower than the 7900 XT and RTX 4080 respectively. Lastly, we finish off our game benchmarks with Total War Pharaoh. At 1440p, we see one of the bigger leads for the 4070 Ti Super over the card it replaces, to the tune of 14%. I don't think we're running out of VRAM here, so this is likely due to the increased memory bandwidth. It's also one of the very few games where the Ti Super outperforms the RX 7900 XT. Likewise, at 4K, this time we're looking at a 15% uplift over the original 4070 Ti, and the Ti Super is now 11% faster than the RX 7900 XT. Overall then, across the 12 games tested, the RTX 4070 Ti Super averaged 104 FPS at 1440p. That makes it 7% faster on average compared to the RTX 4070 Ti, and it's 7% slower than AMD's RX 7900 XT. It also comes in 14% behind the RTX 4080, so there is still a decently sized gap between these two AD103 GPUs. Up at 4K then, we do see the benefits of the wider memory bus, and the Ti Super comes in 8% faster than the original 4070 Ti, while it's still 7% slower than the RX 7900 XT and 15% behind the RTX 4080. As a reminder, Nvidia is suggesting that performance of this Ventus card is about 5% below their expectations, but we can only go on the numbers we have seen and tested for ourselves. Given the 4070 Ti Super is both faster and £30 cheaper than the 4070 Ti's UK launch MSRP, we do actually see a 10% reduction in cost per frame for rasterized performance at 1440p. That's obviously a good improvement and doesn't necessarily factor in the extra longevity that the 16GB frame buffer may provide, though it's also true that there are still better value offerings out there, such as AMD's RX 7800 XT or the recently released RTX 4070 Super. That data though was all based on the MSRP prices, and now we're looking at current retail prices. The 4070 Ti Super doesn't look quite so competitive here, with the RX 7900 XT outperforming it in raster performance while also retailing for less money. Versus the 4070 Super, we're paying about 16% more per frame for the Ti Super, though again, that doesn't take into account the extra longevity that the 16GB frame buffer may provide. Moving on though, it's time to talk about ray tracing, where we're starting our benchmarks with Alan Wake 2 at 1440p. Here, the RTX 4070 Ti Super is the third fast card on our chart, averaging 47 FPS, and that actually makes it 17% faster than the RTX 4070 Ti, and that is much more like it. It's also over twice as fast as the RX 7900 XT, as AMD GPUs really struggle with path tracing in this game. Up at 4K, we actually get a clear example of the benefits of a 16GB frame buffer. Now, I know the 4070 Ti Super performance is still pretty poor at just 25 FPS, though it's an exceptionally demanding game. What we can see, however, is that Nvidia GPUs with 12GB of VRAM absolutely drop off a cliff, whereas the 4070 Ti Super remains a lot more stable. Perhaps this is a sign of things in years to come when 12GB frame buffers may not cut it anymore. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora has no such VRAM issues though, and the scaling here for the 4070 Ti Super is only 4% ahead of the 4070 Ti at 1440p. It's still enough for the Nvidia GPU to come in 6% faster than the RX 7900 XT, but it's not exactly a massive step forward. Likewise, in Cyberpunk 2077, we're only looking at a 5% gain for the 4070 Ti Super over the 4070 Ti, while it's 16% slower than the RTX 4080. Nvidia GPUs absolutely crush AMD in this game, however, so we're still looking at a 26% lead even over AMD's flagship 7900 XTX at 1440p. AMD GPUs do fare a lot better in F123, with the 4070 Ti Super coming in 7% faster than the RX 7900 XT. It also shows a 5% gain compared to the original 4070 Ti at 1440p. Things are also similar in Hitman 3. This time around, the 4070 Ti Super holds a 7% lead over the 4070 Ti, while it's 8% faster than the RX 7900 XT, but still lags 17% behind the RTX 4080. Next up, we have Ratchet and Clank, and again, this is another game where AMD GPUs absolutely get destroyed when ray tracing is enabled. At 1440p, for instance, the 4070 Ti Super is 67% faster than the RX 7900 XT, though it's only 6% ahead of the 4070 Ti. Ratchet and Clank at 4K, however, is another example of the benefits to the 16GB frame buffer. The RTX 4070 Ti and other 12GB cards drop off significantly at this resolution, whereas the 4070 Ti Super stays smooth and averages 38 FPS, and that actually makes it 50% faster than the original 4070 Ti. Moving on to Returnal, however, and this one shows pretty meager gains for the Ti Super over the original 4070 Ti. We're talking just a 3% difference at 1440p, though that is still enough for the new card to come in 10% ahead of the 7900 XT. Finally, we close out with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is pretty light in terms of its ray tracing features, but it still delivers a 22% win for the 4070 Ti Super over the RX 7900 XT at 1440p. We're also looking at a 6% lead for the Ti Super over the original 4070 Ti. On average then, over the 8 ray trace games I tested, the 4070 Ti Super is 6% faster than the original 4070 Ti, so performance scaling is very similar to what we saw from our rasterized games. Nvidia does have a clear lead over AMD for ray tracing, however, with the Ti Super coming in 24% faster than the 7900 XT at 1440p, and it's even 9% ahead of the flagship 7900 XTX. 4K gaming with ray tracing is possible in some games, but this is actually where we see the biggest uplift for the 4070 Ti Super over the original 4070 Ti, as it's 16% faster on average, thanks to the couple of games where we did see a clear benefit in having more than 12GB of VRAM. Time to hit pause though on all of that data and our benchmark charts, and we're now going to take a closer look at the MSI Ventus 3X model that we were sent for testing. From a purely aesthetic standpoint then, MSI is using a two-tone black and silver shroud, which I have to say looks nice enough. My main complaint though is that it is rather plasticky, and I really think build quality should be a lot better considering the price point of the 4070 Ti Super. The same goes for the backplate itself, which is also made of plastic, and I have to say that is pretty disappointing considering we've seen much cheaper cards come with metal backplates. It is a triple fan cooler though, using MSI's Torx 4.0 design, and each fan measures approximately 90mm in diameter. As for the dimensions of the card itself, the Ventus 3X is relatively large, though perhaps not as massive as we've come to expect. It measures in at 308 by 120 by 52mm, while it weighed in at 1085 grams on my scales. Power, meanwhile, is supplied by a single 12V high power or PCIe Gen 5 power connector, though a dual 8-pin adapter is included in the box. Display outputs are also unchanged, with 3 DisplayPort 1.4 and 1 HDMI 2.1. As for how this specific model performs, we'll start by looking at the operating clock speeds. Of course, we've only tested one 4070 Ti Super so far, so we will get a better idea of clock speeds when we can test more cards, but for now, the Ventus 3X model typically ran a bit below 2700 MHz, averaging 2677 MHz over our 30-minute stress test. Thermal performance is no issue for the Ventus 3X either. It kept the GPU to a peak of 67 degrees, with the hotspot at 81 degrees, while memory only hit 76, so we can't really complain. We will of course have to wait and see how these figures compare to the competition, however. That being said, the noise levels are still very decent. Under load, we saw the fan spin at 37% or 1370 RPM, and that produced just 35 decibels of noise, which is a very similar level to the RTX 4070 Super Founders Edition. Moving on to power draw then, as a reminder, for this we use Nvidia's PCAT tool, so we test power draw of the graphics card only at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, so we can be very precise with our data. If you do want to see results on a per game level over all 3 resolutions tested, then you can find that over in the written review on KitGuruTech, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to take a look at the average results. At 1440p then, we can see average power draw hits 247.8 watts, and that is well below the rated 285 watt TGP. It's also just a 6 watt increase over the original 4070 Ti, and it's actually on par with AMD's RX 7800 XT, and that I think gives you a good idea about how much more efficient Ada Lovelace GPUs are compared to their RDNA 3 rivals. Speaking of efficiency, here we can see the 4070 Ti Super is still delivering very similar results to other RTX 40 series GPUs. It does actually offer 5% better performance per watt than the 4070 Ti, but the real win is against AMD, where the Ti Super is actually 16% more efficient than the RX 7900 XT. Lastly then, we're going to finish up with a quick look at overclocking. Interestingly, MSI has actually locked the power limit at 100%, so you can't push this above 285 watts. Still, we were able to add 190 MHz to the GPU core and 1600 MHz to the memory. This brought average clock speed up to just below 2930 MHz in the real world, resulting in performance gains of between 5 to 7% in the 3 games that I retested. It's fine, but no great shakes. Power draw also barely changed with the overclock, coming in just 1 watt higher than what we saw at stock. All in all then, the RTX 4070 Ti Super is, despite the ridiculous name, another solid refresh from Nvidia. Right from the get-go, this was always going to be the card I was most interested in because it corrects the main criticism we had of both the 4070 Ti and the 4070, that being the fact that they shipped with 12 gigs of VRAM. The 4070 Ti Super now corrects that issue and also chucks in an extra 10% CUDA cores. Admittedly, I was expecting the extra core count to make more of a difference than it did. In games where VRAM is not a factor, for instance, performance is just 5 to 6% better than the 4070 Ti at 1440p, or 8% better on average at 4K. We did have an update from Nvidia on Sunday night, however, and they are suggesting that performance of this MSI Ventus 3X model specifically is about 5% below their expectations, though MSI is said to be working on updates. The new BIOS I was sent didn't make much of a difference at all though, and if we do get any more updates I'll be sure to share them, and we may even do some more testing. But for now though, the numbers shown in this review is really all I have to go on, and that's what I've based my conclusions on. That does mean that the RX 7900 XT is still pretty competitive for rasterization, coming out slightly faster on average but at a lower price, and we've seen it as low as £720 over the last few days, as AMD is clearly trying to spoil the party. Nvidia does still have a clear lead over AMD in terms of ray tracing, however. Even with my card performing below expectations, I still saw the 4070 Ti Super coming in at 24% faster on average than the 7900 XT at 1440p in ray trace games, and in certain titles like Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk 2077, the margins were even bigger. If you're wondering as well about 16 gigs of VRAM on the 4070 Ti Super versus 12 gigs of VRAM on the 4070 Ti, I did actually see a couple of examples today where there was a clear benefit to the 16 gig frame buffer. On both occasions, it was at 4K with ray tracing enabled in Alan Wake 2 and also Ratchet and Clank, where the 4070 Ti fell off a cliff, but the 4070 Ti Super kept things stable and much smoother. Admittedly, in most games today, you're not going to see a difference because of the frame buffer, but clearly the advantage to 16 gigs will be down the line in 2 to 3 years when more and more games are using up more VRAM. In that regard then, the 4070 Ti Super is a much needed improvement over the original 4070 Ti, correcting the main criticism we had of that card, while also offering 10% more cores, all at the same price. That really does make it pretty much a no-brainer, and I now have no reservations about recommending this graphics card. Of course, the RX 7900 XT remains competitive, especially if your main priority is rasterized gaming, but I think for many, if you're spending this much money on a graphics card, you're also going to be interested in ray tracing, DLSS, and the increased efficiency. I know if I had about 800 quid to drop on a new GPU, my vote would go for the 4070 Ti Super. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, I want to hear from you down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. I'd also love for you to come on, carry on the conversation with us in our Discord server, which is linked in the description. And while you're there, you can also check out a link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for KitGuru, and I'll see you in the next video.